This is London. Tonight, London is a city of song and celebration and thanksgiving. There are fireworks and parties. Air raid shelters are as remote as the covered wagon. Many words have been spoken and much drink has been consumed. London has been somewhat hysterical and still is. The organized killing has ended in Europe. The young men of many nations have suffered, sacrificed, and achieved victory. The coming months and years will reveal what will be done with that victory. That was part of a broadcast I did to the States from Broadcasting House about 15 years ago. I had had the high privilege of trying to report from Britain during her finest and darkest hours, trying to report the suffering, the sacrifice, and the steadiness of her people. Now that I am in Britain again, I should like to examine, however briefly, what Britain has done with her years of victory. I have not yet reached the stage where my own reminiscences fascinate me, but perhaps we might hold the door of memory ajar just for a few minutes. This is London today, an ancient and curiously intimate town. Its people stand very steady in their shoes. At a time of crisis, they fly into a great calm. For this reporter, there are many ghosts about. You remember that an incendiary burnt itself out in that little street. Your best friend was killed on that very corner. You pass a car park and recall that there used to be a pub, hit with a 2,000-pounder one night, 30 people killed. It's easy to imagine that old friends are walking here. Some of the boys you watched jump at Arnhem, flyers you watched go down in flames over Berlin, or a dozen other targets. You wonder what's happened to the American boys who used to stand on those street corners far from home and very lonesome. You recall a broadcast made on August 31st, 1939, which said,
"If you have a child of school age and wish to have him evacuated, you should send him to school tomorrow, Friday, with hand luggage containing the child's gas mask, a change of underclothing, night clothes, shoes, spare stockings or socks, a toothbrush, a comb, a towel, soap, face cloth, handkerchief, and if possible, a warm coat or mackintosh."
45 minutes ago, the Prime Minister announced that a state of war existed between Britain and Germany. Air raid instructions were immediately broadcast. And almost directly following that broadcast, the air raid warning screamed through the quiet calm of the Sabbath morning. I'm not a very good sociologist, but I can tell you this from personal experience, that sirens would increase your knowledge of even your most intimate friend. This is a class-conscious country, but if a man with an unearned income is caught in the streets when the siren sounds, he may have a waitress stepping on his heels and see before him the broad back of a laborer as he goes underground. The real change comes to London at night. Then it is a city of sounds, generally slow, cautious sounds. What it really looks like at night, I can't tell you, because I've never been able to see more of it than has been disclosed by the beam of my puny flashlight. I've been doing a little research this week, looking into the general subject of London's nightlife. Business is good, has in fact improved since war came. People come early and stay late. I left one place at 3:30 the other morning. No one else showed any disposition to leave. And so far as I know, they may still be there, dancing to a rather mediocre tune called "We'll Hang Out the Washing on the Siegfried Line." The evacuation of Allied troops from the area around Dunkirk continues. Barges, lifeboats, paddle steamers, anything that will float is being used to take them off. The evacuation is being carried out from open beaches. No figures can be given concerning the total number saved, but there is reason to believe that more men will be taken off than we ever dared to hope. I saw the men arrive. Many of them were dazed, battered, and bleeding, but they were not beaten. Many men brought their rifles back with them, and defeat was not in their face. The main subject of speculation here today is, what will Hitler do next? A colossal military disaster has occurred, and another blow must be expected immediately. Home defense must be built up. The Home Guard is forming. There are sergeants of 60 and captains of 25. There are corporals and privates who went out in 14 with the old Contemptibles. Signposts are being taken down on the roads that might be used by Germans invading this country. This year, there is no holiday, and the coasts are deserted, except for those soldiers, sailors, and airmen who are preparing to fight unwelcome visitors from across the North Sea and the Channel. In the warm, cloudless days of August and September, the young men of the Royal Air Force have been beating back the greatest air fleet ever assembled by any nation. Decisive battles of history are being fought by a few, high in the blue sky. At the beginning, they fought over the English Channel, then over the coast of Kent, and now the battle is moving inland to London. You can have little understanding of the life in London these days. There are no words to describe the thing that is happening. The courage of the people, the flash and roar of the guns rolling down the streets, the stench of the air raid shelters. In 3 or 4 hours, people must get up and go to work, just as though they had a full night's rest, free from the rumble of guns and the wonder that comes when they wake and listen in the dead hours of the night. At dawn, Londoners come oozing out of the ground, tired and red-eyed and sleepy. The fires are dying down. I saw them turn into their own street to see if their house was still standing. No one could avoid being impressed with the patience and calm determination of these people who dwell in little houses. This morning, Mr. Churchill walked through the East End after a heavy raid. The people cheered him. He said, "They act as though I had brought them a great victory," and there were tears in his eyes. This is not a Merry Christmas in London. I heard that phrase only twice in the last 3 days. It can't be a Merry Christmas, for these people who spend tonight in the shelters realize they have bought their Christmas with their nerves, their bodies, and their buildings. Probably the best summary of this year that is dying was written by Wordsworth in 1806. Another year, another deadly blow, another mighty empire overthrown, and we are left, or shall be left, alone, the last that dared to struggle with the foe. At a time when most men, save Englishmen, despaired of England's life, there occurred a most remarkable development, a veritable flooding out of pamphlets, books, discussions on war aims. On the edge of defeat, you were discussing what to do with the victory. I should like to quote from one of those pamphlets. "We fight not to restore, but to rebuild. To many, perhaps to most of those who have been rendered homeless, it would be poor tribute to promise the mere restoration of what they have lost. Out of the horror must come a better housed as well as a better fed British people." If I were to try to sum up the purpose of these publications, it would be in this fashion. You were determined that the Britain after the war would not be the same as the Britain before the war. It would be better housed, better fed, better clothed, and fully employed. The equality of sacrifice that had obtained during the war would be replaced by an equality of opportunity. In short, fair shares for all. If one were to find the realization of these war aims in any one area in London, it would be reasonable to expect to find it in the East End, which suffered so terribly during the Blitz and stood so steady during it. Today, the East End still carries marks of that attack. You come across large, flattened areas where once stood narrow streets with drab little houses, 2/3 of them shared by more than one family. You come across the shell of a church where the Reverend St. John Grocer held his usual services until one night in April 1941, it was set ablaze, and 500 sheltering people were rescued from the crypt. Father Grocer, I hope you will permit me to say that I am aware that I am in the presence of one of the great spirits of London. You lived and worked and prayed with the people of the East End during all that time, and you're still doing it. Tell me, What has happened to the announced war aims so far as the East End of London is concerned?
Well, of course, an enormous lot has been done, and because it had to be done. I mean, in my borough, for instance, we started the war with, 206,000 people. We finished off with 54,000. That's the measure of the damage to houses. And, of course, it swept away most of the slums, not all of them, but a good many of them. And we just had to rebuild. And on the whole, it's been a very first-class piece of work, up to a point.
Has there been much improvement in education, housing, food, employment, and so forth?
Food, yes. People are healthier. Children are healthier. They got school meals and all sorts of things. The Health Act has done an enormous lot to make possible all sorts of changes and better conditions for people. Housing, up to a point, I say. But there's a large area still that's not touched at all. Education, attempts have been made at it, but we've still got a lot of very old schools, haven't been enough schools built. The greatest difficulty, I think, is in teachers. We can't get teachers, good teachers, to come and work in East London in sufficient numbers. The classes are very much too big, and so on. But a great deal has been done.
Is it true, Father Grosser, that in one sense, or perhaps many senses, the war came to the East End as a sort of relief?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you can look at the situation in East London right back, well, I'm just taking my own time. I went to East London just after George Lansbury had come out of prison for trying to feed people who were desperately hungry and trying to deal with the real social problems. And then the awful period during the dirty 30s, with that mass unemployment, all that suffering that went on, just seemed there was no end to it. And therefore, when the war broke out, it was a real sense of relief. People felt at last they were wanted, they got a job to do, and the whole situation became really, I call, happy situation in spite of the bombing.
It was true, was it not, that the people in the East End took their bombing a little better than the people in the West End?
Well, I hadn't got much experience of West End.
Well, I did, and I assure you it was true.
But certainly they were marvelous, amazing, really. All sorts of situations that cropped up in which they themselves, with some sort of leadership, just faced and dealt with themselves in an amazing way, when it's impossible to do very much in the way of organization from, say, Whitehall.
Is it true, Father Grosser, that most of the improvements have occurred in connection with the people who contribute directly to the national economy?
Ah, yes. I mean, that's really, we're getting down to the crux of it. When you say that on the whole, the working classes are better off, I mean, taking East London as a standard, it's true. There's fairly full employment, not entire, but so on, all sorts of things that are wrong. But it's the moral aspect of things that worries me really is the fact that people who are not what I would call essential to the national economy just get left out. I could give you various instances of that if you wanted to.
Please do.
Well, take, for instance, old people. Old people today are not very much better off, certainly haven't had their right share of the rise in the standard of living. That's one side of it. And the same, I think, with regard to housing. It's true, we built a great many houses. But the worst section of the people, worst housed section of the people, are again the old people to whom very little has been done. They've got no way, in the sense of enforcing their demands. They aren't essential to the national economy, and so they tend to get left out.
Since the war, from the heart of the East End, 100,000 people have moved away. There are new houses and modern flats for over 5,000 families who stayed behind. Some of the pre-war terraces still remain, but not for long. And yet, despite better living standards, better health, higher wages, some of the working men on the neighboring docks still complain.
Take our dock industry, for instance. There's small things in there what could do a lot more improvement, such as this mechanisation what they're bringing in. And different firms are bringing this mechanisation in at their own expense, for their own benefit, not for the worker.
I've cut a few capers in my time, but at the same time, my own opinion, this dock is it's filthy.
When a docker goes to work for 10 hours a day, and after the 2 hours,
the 2 hours overtime, and Sunday should never be taxed. It's the greatest liberty ever been took with a worker in his life to a docker. Because the only thing what stops a docker having a go is when he gets to about 14 pounds or something like that, he's not got the initiative to have a go. He wants to turn it up because there's 8 and 6 in a pound. And some won't have it at all.
London docks, once a target of many a raid, have too often stood silent since the war. The docker has won many a material and social aim, but strikes, official and unofficial, have continued. Over 240 since 1945, and each year an average of 120,000 man-days has been lost. To Mr. Frank Cousins, General Secretary of the largest trade union in Britain, I put this question. Why so many strikes in Britain?
So many as what? You see, surely you're not accepting this newspaper suggestion that there are more strikes than we used to have. There are a number, but the fraction compared with peacetime, and in fact, fraction compared with most other industrial countries.
What has produced the strikes that have occurred? Has it been jurisdictional problems, automation, mechanization? What is it, Mr. Cousins?
Once or twice jurisdictional, and of course they're the most difficult ones to justify at all, particularly to outsiders. When you get an argument apparently between two unions as to which group of men do a job, then it is difficult to explain. Very few people realize that quite frequently even these disputes are men trying to protect their living, trying to save themselves becoming a part of the unemployed that exists. And you'll find that many of these jurisdictional strikes, demarcation disputes as we call them, happen in areas where there's a high level of unemployment. The things have a relationship to each other. But the disputes that take place in other fields, many of them are sheer lack of understanding of the real job of industrial relations.
We were talking a little earlier about war aims. You remember all the books and pamphlets that were published on that cheap paper setting forth the war aims? To what extent do you think they have been realized?
We were talking at that time of a new order of security and employment, which has not yet been established. We were talking against the possible return of unemployment, and that's not been fully dealt with at the moment. We've had a measure of unemployment returned to us.
During that campaign, promises were made in the area of better health, better education, better housing, full employment. In what area would you think the most progress has been made?
Well, it's difficult to know where the most progress is made. There's been a substantial measure of progress made in this question of full employment when one looks at the pre-war period. But how far that's related to legislation that was passed at that time, or how much it's related to circumstances which flowed as a consequence of the damage during the war, it's not possible to really determine.
Mr. Cousins, if you could choose one thing in the area of projected war aims, if you could establish a priority for one thing, what would it be?
I've talked quite frequently with some of the big employers and some of my trade union colleagues that I think we should have made a great priority about this permanency of employment, the security that a man who's worked at a place and feels he's still willing to work at the place ought to know that his job is there, and that if, by circumstance outside the control of either the employer or himself, the job isn't available, that it ought not be regarded as a problem for him, but a problem for the community.
Mr. Cousins, we both know what labor did in this country in the last war. It was an incredible performance of steadiness and staunchness and willing to sacrifice and willingness to give up some of its hard-won rights. What would happen if a similar crisis arose now?
I have said in a public platform, when anybody from the opposite political side raises any doubts about where we stand, I think it's offensive. We don't have to prove ourselves. We do it every time there's a need.
Mr. Cousins is obviously convinced that if another testing time should come, then British labor will stand where it did 20 years ago. But it seemed to me that not all of the changes in Britain occurred in the ranks of organized labor. You became, as a people, rather more casual. You talked a little more. Not quite so much class distinction. After all, at 3 o'clock in the morning in an air raid shelter, it was rather difficult to distinguish on the basis of financial income or social position. I thought to ask a few questions on this subject of changed manners and behavior of an old friend, Professor Dennis Brogan. Dennis, would you say there is as much class consciousness now as there was in 1937, 38?
I think there's as much class consciousness, but I think people are perhaps not so sore about it because it's not so closely identified with economic inequality. That's to say, people who are making 20, 25 pounds a week may be perfectly conscious that they are not received at the local tennis club and don't want to be. But on the other hand, I'm astonished by the number of people who are wearing fancy blazers and club ties. far more people do that, there must be far more societies who issue coats of arms than ever before. This is a kind of equality because everybody, I can't think of anybody who isn't eligible for some kind of club tie and for some kind of blazer, but it's certainly very marked.
Do you see any reflection of class consciousness in the course of the recent political campaign?
I'm always told that people stop voting Labour as they become more prosperous, and I'm quite certain that some do. No, I think the only thing I would say is that the new class structure with very prosperous, skilled workmen presents problems of propaganda, which I don't think the Labour Party got round to in time. How you appeal to a man who's got a car and a TV set, he may be in debt for all these things, but nevertheless he's got them. And it seems the image of the working man with his trousers tied up with string and the cloth cap and all of that is a false image. Most workers are not like that. I don't believe that everybody whose income gets up to £20 a week automatically becomes a Conservative. I think the other things keep them on the Labour side of the fence, or would keep them on the Labour side of the fence if the Labour Party knew where the fence was.
It seemed that during the war, the issues were clear: survival and victory. There was more than a little idealism in the air. I wondered how much of that idealism of their parents had rubbed off on the younger generation.
What I would like to see, universally, is for people to understand each other more, find out what makes each other tick.
I would like to live in a world where a true system of socialism was in practice, but I can see at the moment that it wouldn't work. I think we must have mild capitalism.
I think I'd like to live in a world that is united, peaceful. Don't want any more wars. I don't think anybody else does want any more wars. But being a student of architecture, I would like a world of beautiful buildings around me and good environment, but a world of peace, I think.
Well, I'm quite happy as I am at the moment. There isn't much in the way of current affairs that really affects me personally.
Apart from things like atom bombs and what have you, I'm quite satisfied.
Well, it's going to be very difficult to get this world, but a peaceful world.
For a long, long time, the pivot of world affairs was right here in Britain. That is no longer true. Twice in a generation, you have poured out your men, your money, and your metal in defense of freedom. Your empire has withered due to your own policies and your own designs, and the relative power now rests with the United States and the Soviet Union. Twice in a century, you have suffered terribly at the hands of the Germans. Your leaders and mine continue to say that there can be no peace or tranquility in Europe until Germany is reunited. I wonder just how interested you were in the subject of the reunification of Germany.
I'm afraid I'm not terribly interested in what happens to Germany, quite honestly. I don't really care. I know they're getting to be a big power again, all that kind of stuff, but I'm not a bit fussy whether they get split in two or stay as they are, or get together again. It doesn't matter to me at all.
No, I think they should be kept apart. I mean, we've trusted them in the past 40 years twice and they've let us down, so I think we should keep them apart.
Well, they're a whole people, aren't they? And I don't think it's right that two people should, a whole body of people should be split up like that.
I think that they should not be unified. They should be kept as weak as possible, although I realise that that is rather a sweeping statement in view of other aspects of the European situation.
In any free society, foreign policy is a combination of the hopes, fears, and aspirations of the people. But one man must speak for all. So I have come to put one question to Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary. Foreign Secretary, as a result of the great outpouring of men, money, and metal that Britain has undertaken in the course of 2 wars, her actual position of strength is less than it was. The focal point of power is now in the United States and in the Soviet Union. Is this not likely to cause you to contract out, to say that you want no part of this great power struggle that is now in process?
Well, I quite agree with you that the United States and the Soviet Union have got bigger population, more territory, more natural resources, and larger military establishments than we have. That's quite true. But I'm not quite so certain that that is the only thing that matters in terms of the world in which we live in today. I think myself that influence is really what counts. I think we have new values to work out, and I'm not certain that the whole thing is to be settled in terms of absolute power. Now, when you come to the question of influence, I think we have got a tremendous opportunity, we, Great Britain. And I'll tell you why I think this. First of all, we're the heart of the Commonwealth. Now, no great empire has ever so willingly or so deliberately handed over power to its constituent members. And I think we have in this Commonwealth, of which we are the heart, we have a tremendous scope for influence. That's the first reason. The second reason is that I think we are a kind of link between Europe and the Atlantic community. And one of the happiest things I think about our situation today is the closeness of our cooperation with the United States. I think we have a very important function to fulfill as a link between Europe and the Atlantic community. And finally, and I hope you won't think I'm being at all arrogant in what I say, I do think that so far as influence is concerned, maturity and judgment do count. I think we do have, to some extent, those qualities. And I cannot give a better example than really of what happened last February. I think the visit the Prime Minister and I paid to Moscow was at that particular moment the right initiative to take. I think it changed the whole turn of events. And I think it was an example of judgment in the field of international politics.
Well, certainly what you say about the government position, particularly in relation to your visit to Moscow, is correct. But I seem to have noticed in the course of the last political campaign that there was considerable indifference or apathy in the whole field of foreign affairs. Is this not likely to lead to a degree of neutralism?
Well, I don't ought to agree with what you say about the election. I mean, I found that there was, in fact, great interest in these issues of foreign policy. But the plain fact of the matter is, in the world of today, no country can contract out of these issues. If you say, well, why do we not stand aside and leave it to the United States and the Soviet Union to settle things among themselves? But we have a vital interest in how they're settled. And we must play a part in that settlement, because the plain fact of the matter is that if any group of countries now decide to put things to the arbitrament of war, that means destruction for all of us. And therefore we are vitally concerned in the evolution of events, and we have no intention, as I said, of contracting out. We cannot, in our own interest.
I would like to suggest that in the course of the last 20 years, the positions of our two countries have been reversed. Twice in the last 20 years, the new world came to the assistance of the old. First, when we were propelled into the war by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. And secondly, when we undertook what has come to be known as the Marshall Plan. Now we need you. We need you not only as an aircraft carrier, we need you also for your counsel, for your restraint, and for your experience. I am fully aware that we in the United States are not an easy ally. We haven't had very much experience at it. But we're coming increasingly to recognize that without you, we are in fact isolated. You in this country carry a burden of accumulated fatigue. Certainly you deserve a period of relaxation and prosperity. But I have the feeling that it is not to be, because in a phrase that is rather better known in your country than in mine, I have the feeling that still the ball is at your feet.